Nerds, we are live and it is championship week, and I think we got some people that got some interesting things to say. We do too. So get at us in the chat and we'll try to communicate with you there as we walk through what's going on right now. We are in the middle of some games, Josh, and we're going to get into all the stuff that's happened so far this week, so y'all don't worry about that. But I think we still have some playoff implications. And I saw our good friend Josh Pate say something earlier today about how this committee is made up of humans and they're going to be influenced by things that happen, and maybe not just things that happen at the end, after TCU barely lost to Kansas State. Josh, these other games are input. The SEC championship game was information. The Michigan Purdue game is information. So I don't want to get into a whole playoff thing because we probably will in a little bit. But if, let's say, Purdue manages to beat Michigan tonight, does that change your perception of Ohio State versus Alabama or TCU? Giving you an easy one out the gate.
I mean, it has to change it at some level, right? Like you said, everything's an input. And you give me an easy one, but you're also setting me up to draw the ire of every commenter in the chat section. I mean, it does change my opinion. That doesn't necessarily mean I think it means that Ohio State and Michigan should both be left out for Alabama. As I watch Nick Saban join the halftime in the Michigan game in the corner of my eye here, lobbying for the playoff. But it is information. And we've often talked about how we don't feel like you should be penalized for playing an extra game. The fact that you made the conference championship game and someone didn't shouldn't necessarily mean that you get penalized over someone that did. The problem comes into play when we're talking about extra data from the perspective, especially of teams that don't necessarily have the resume of other teams. And what I mean by that is what is USC's best win to this point in the season, right? And so they played Utah, they lost. They played Notre Dame, they won by a good margin. We're kind of judging them off a handful of games. And something that's been driving me low-key nuts is people talk about how many ranked teams there are in the pack. I'll be honest, like that is a circle the wagon situation. The pack has not played very many out-of-conference games at all this season. Daniel might touch on that in a minute. And so we don't really know where all these teams stand. We don't really know a lot about USC relative to all the other teams that are being compared to. And so the conference championship game does matter to me for two big reasons. One, they're not a conference champion. So the whole argument of they were the best in their conference, you can't put a non-conference champion over them, completely goes out the window. And two, it tells me, hey, this USC team that lost to Utah, it wasn't a fluke. They do have those real flaws. They can lose to those teams on the regular. That is who they are. And I can't just ignore that part of it. So I think it doesn't play into my mind quite as much from a resume perspective as it does from a overall quality validation perspective. And I'll say there was no question tied to it. So Sean, if you want to throw in one, feel free. But Sean Hanlon with $5 super chat, much appreciated.
So Evie in the chat said no team, even Alabama, should be let in with 2 losses. And I fundamentally disagree with this. Not that it's Alabama or anybody else. The thing that I disagree with is the notion that no 2-loss team should ever get in. What if there were no 1-loss or undefeated teams? What if all the conference champions had 2 losses? So every year, we say this 1,000 times a season, every year is its own thing. Right now, I get a little bit of the sense, Josh, and look, we'll get in our rankings later. I'm not saying that I'm putting Alabama in the playoffs, but I get a little bit of a sense that Alabama this year is being compared to previous Alabama teams with the notion that they don't deserve to be in. While I agree, even Alabama teams that have lost, I don't think this Alabama team beats 2016 or 2018 Alabama, but those teams aren't in the field. So I think that the discussion becomes, if we're talking about playoffs, is it most deserving or is it best team? If it's most deserving, it's hard for me to let Alabama in. If it's best team, then we need to compare, that last game, the first game that TCU played Kansas State, they were down 18, and then there's a quarterback situation, right? I think actually Will Howard got hurt too. But then tonight they couldn't beat a team when all the marbles were on the table. They couldn't beat a team that lost to Tulane, right? That doesn't mean that they're necessarily worse than Alabama. That's what we have to kind of suss out. But it really comes down to these two things. It's not fair to compare Alabama this year to 2018 or 2016 Alabama if you're not going to compare TCU or USC or Ohio State. Having said that, this year's Alabama team does have warts, but this has been such a crazy, I would argue more crazy than 2007 year, that just saying because they have 2 losses is a little bit lazy in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, it's more than, I think, a little lazy. I mean, I think it goes beyond that slightly, even that it goes to sort of a misunderstanding of what the situation is. The top 4 teams should always be the 4 best teams. And what that means in a given year is going to vary wildly. There have been years when we have a bunch of undefeated teams. There were years ago, it hasn't happened in a while. You might have 5 undefeated teams in a given season. And there have been years where you don't have 3 teams with 1 loss out of a major conference. And so we always talk about when people want to compare across years, and people have been doing that on Twitter with us for forever since we've had a Twitter. I've kind of given up on that argument. I'll let you continue to try to fight that fight, Daniel, but I'm just giving up because I'm exhausted from it. Because the reality is, the landscape changes season to season. When you say a 2-loss team shouldn't be in, great. If you want to say 2017 Alabama didn't deserve to be in the playoff, we have agreed with that statement since its inception. We've also said they deserve to be in more than anyone else in 2017. And that's the rub, because the same people saying that a 2-loss team should never be in were the same people that were arguing that a 2-loss Ohio State should have been in 2017 because they were a conference champion and Alabama with 1 loss was not, right? I guarantee you a lot of the people making this argument said that. And it's because, there's just years when there are not 4 deserving teams. I would actually argue this is going to be one of those years. There are not 4 deserving teams this year. And that's reality. And yet, we're going to go to 12 teams, because how do you solve the problem of not having 4 deserving teams? You add 8 more, and somehow that fixes it. It baffles me a little bit. That is what it is.
Josh, the craziness of this year, I just thought about this. If Michigan loses, they're still in the playoffs, right? Yes or no?
Yes. I think Michigan's probably the biggest lock of all of them outside Georgia.
If that happens, we're only going to have 1 conference champion in the playoffs. That is crazy. So you said this year we may not have good 3rd and 4th place teams. This might be the year that we almost only have 1.
Yeah, and I figure we'll do a tweet or something about this, because I think they're going to try to sweep it under the rug. Has anyone actually taken the time to figure out what the 12-team playoff format would look like this year? Because I tweeted about it at one point because I hadn't seen anyone mention it. It's a freaking nightmare, because we have a format where you have to be a conference champion to be top 4. That is absolutely black letter part of the proposal that got passed. So 12-team playoff, first 4 get a bye, but they have to be 4 conference champions. Well, your 3rd and 4th ranked conference champion, assuming results hold, is going to be Clemson, and it's going to be Kansas State. If Michigan loses, your first round would be Georgia, Clemson, Kansas State, Utah, and then you would have Ohio. Then you'd have, I don't know if it'd be Ohio State or Michigan, probably Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, 5, 6, 7. And your bracket would be awful. And I haven't taken the time to write it all out, but the problem is when you start talking about who gets paired with who, you're going to have a situation where, like Alabama and Michigan and Georgia are all in the same quarter of the bracket. And the other side is like Kansas State, Utah, Tulane. Like it's going to be really screwed up. And that's what happens when you don't seed 1 to 12 in quality. I think it's fine to seed 1 to 12. You've got a mixed best team like they've been doing in terms of resume and overall quality combined. But to just force this automatic qualifier conference thing, it always sounds great to people in the complete abstract. But then when you talk about the few times it actually matters, the few times you're actually insisting on putting a conference champion in over a non-conference champion, you're always talking about a conference champion that's clearly inferior. else they'd be in. And it always sucks. But people don't want to look at it from that real perspective.
And James Richardson says this would have been a great year for the expanded CFP. I would argue that this would have been a great year to expand to 12 to determine who was the fourth or fifth best team, not to determine who was an actual champion, which is what the college football playoffs is going to end up doing. It's going to end up saying like, oh, look, we had the 12th best team in the country was underrated because they beat the 7th best team and then they got murdered by somebody in the next round. It keeps coming up, and Josh, I think that there's a little bit of whistling past the graveyard from people that are fans of teams that are firmly in the playoffs about saying Bama shouldn't be in there. It really comes down to most deserving versus best team. I don't think that, and I tweeted this in defense of Ohio State. So Ohio State fans, you can appreciate this a little bit. I said, look, if margins don't matter, if we're just going to say who's got the best wins, the best losses, then margins don't matter, because I would argue that losing at home by 3 touchdowns is worse than losing on the road on the last play of the game or on a neutral site in overtime to what we are all agreeing is the 9th best team in the country or whatever Kansas State ends up being. If margins don't matter, then we can gloss over the fact that Ohio State got blown out. I'm okay with that. But then if you're saying, wait, they got blown out, with that matters, then it also matters that Ohio State won all their games except for that one by double digits, and TCU won 5 games by 1 score and then lost one tonight. 5 games by 1 score, and those 1 score opponents are like unranked Oklahoma State with a backup quarterback, unranked, maybe ranked Kansas with a backup quarterback. SMU, they beat SMU by 1 score. So those things, if we're going to talk about best team, you can't just look at win-loss records. You have to look at the fact that, yes, Alabama played an SEC schedule. Ohio State played a Big Ten schedule. I don't think SEC West or Big Ten East are in the same league right now as playing a Big 12 schedule and having 5 of those games coming down to the wire.
Yeah. It's tough. If there's one argument this year, I would say this is the year that there is something of an argument for an expanded playoff. It's that we're trying to make these apples and oranges comparisons between different conference schedules, and you're likely to see some teams get left out that might be better teams than the teams that are included, frankly.
But Josh, can I redirect or touch on that? Really, like, have you touched on
Sure.
that? Because my point is, yes, it's a great year for expanded playoffs because we don't really know who the 4th best team is. But it's not a great year for expanded playoffs for saying, we might leave somebody out that deserves to play against Georgia or that deserves to be on equal footing against Georgia.
Yeah, no, you're at. I mean, yeah, and I guess I was skipping over that because I felt like it was the point we'd made earlier that the reality is this is just not a season where there's 4 deserving teams. There's just not. In terms of what most people in this chat, most people out there would normally say is a deserving team in a given year, there aren't 4. And there are a bunch of super chats we need to get to, and I'm kind of holding off on some just to try to get them in a topical manner. But, Killtack9, it just said, don't do this, guys. You're supposed to be data guys. The playoff committee says it's 4 best teams, not most deserving. Alabama would beat TCU and USC. Well, I mean, I think it's subjective to see Alabama would beat TCU and USC, and we'll probably talk on that in more depth because you have to dig into that in a weird way. But when you say best teams, what do you mean? I mean, I've always said the best team is the team that doesn't lose games, that beats good teams, that wins games, that dominates teams, et cetera, et cetera. Alabama hasn't necessarily done that. To be the best team, you probably ought to win your conference or win your division. But, and I'll own that I was the one that tweeted earlier, like, hey, keep in mind, they don't have divisions right now in the Pac-12 and the Big 12. They just have the 2 highest ranked teams play each other. And people got in really like pedantic in terms of tiebreakers, but the SEC, it's just not analogous. They have divisional tiebreakers. They don't have interdivisional tiebreakers. Like, there's nothing that says Tennessee is second over Alabama. That doesn't work that way because they're in separate divisions. There's no tiebreaker across divisions. If they were all in the same group, there are a lot of other things that would come to play differently because they're not round robin either. So it's, there's a lot out there to make it really, really difficult. But I think the reality is, it's just not a season where it came out cleanly. The fact that it didn't come out cleanly is because we didn't really have enough teams that should have made it. And I think it also highlights how unlikely and unusual it is for the top teams to not win their conference titles, because it usually happens. And I will say, in the cases where those teams don't win their conference titles, they don't win the conference championship games, I think by the way the bowls play out, you usually realize there's a reason for it. The teams that are really, really, truly elite championship caliber teams in the playoff era or even in the CS era, they usually win those championship games, look good doing so, and then they turn around and win the playoff. Or a couple times, maybe you miss the conference championship game due to weirdness, but you're not, when you're on the big stage and you got to be focused and things are on the line. Those teams that are going to perform in the playoff are also going to perform on that stage. And if you can't do it in the conference championship game, I don't think it's very likely that you turn around, play a team in like Georgia that is radically better than Kansas State in every phase. There's nothing that Kansas State does as well as Georgia, and you're going to show up and play them and suddenly show out against them. I just don't think it's really likely.
Yeah, and I think that, so we can talk about some more of these super chats. Benjamin V says, not sure if you covered it yet. Can't tune in live. Do you know who you'd lean towards Michigan Ohio State rematch? That's an interesting one, and I'm not going to say because we're going to do a preview, but I will say that, and Benjamin V is a Michigan fan, I think. Michigan fans will absolutely crush us if we pick Ohio State in the rematch. But, and I'm not saying I will, I need to look at that game, but it wouldn't be unprecedented to, like, this happened last year. Alabama absolutely drilled Georgia and turned around and lost to Georgia. And yeah, there were some injuries or whatever, but they lost to Georgia. They, like, that's not out of the question. It happens all the time. So I don't think it's unrealistic. I'll be interested to see what Vegas thinks about that, because I don't think that Michigan fans will be as comfortable with the point spread as maybe they think they deserve. Josh,
let me say this, absent injuries, if Michigan and Ohio State are playing in a rematch, I expect Ohio State will be favored. That doesn't, I'm not saying that means who I'll pick, but that is something that I feel free to say right now, is I expect Ohio State will be favored if they play in a rematch.
And it's even more analogous to last year. And I don't think Alabama was, like, they might have been favored against Georgia in the rematch, but it wasn't by much. The way Alabama won the game against Georgia was really turning the game sideways on a few very explosive plays. And I saw a stat today, I think it was outside of a handful of runs or a handful of plays, Michigan ran for like 2-point-something yards per carry. They didn't dominate the line of scrimmage. Stroud had a long time to throw. So in terms of how that game went, it wasn't like, if you just look at the final score, you think, oh my God, Ohio State got blown out. But I want people to understand that Vegas doesn't care about that. They care about how the actual game went. And how that game went was a handful of explosive plays that you, because Ohio State has secondary issues, you might be able to recreate. You might not. But if you don't get those plays, if McCarthy overthrows on the first, the first bomb or one, you don't get a run fit on the long run, that game is completely different. And so I think that that's part of it. And it's no offense to Michigan. They earned the win and they'll earn the second spot in the playoffs, but they might have to play Ohio State in the first round.
Yeah. I don't know. Like you said, I don't want to go too far in trying to figure that out, but I do agree with you. A couple more super chats, and I'll touch on them. Stephen Light said, "Isn't college football a glorious sport?" And I mean, this is the fun part of it, right? Anything can happen on any given week. The chaos is entertaining. We all love it. This has been a fun week if you're into that, for sure, which I think most people are. I think it's funny that everybody, we're at the point where we just passed the resolution to get the playoff in 2024. So everybody's really in these NFL comparisons. And it just so happens you have a much more NFL-like year in terms of weird results. And so everybody's on top of it. I do pause and say, I don't think this is some like magical shift where it's going to be like this every year. It's pretty clear this is a thing that happens once every like 8 years in college football. So this isn't going to be normal. but it's certainly fun when it happens. Mike Farino said, "How's it going? Sorry, I wasn't in last week. Was way too upset to look at anything football related for the past week." I appreciate it, Mike. Mike's been a big supporter. I mean, huge super chat, Mike. So I appreciate it. And then all you guys that support the channel, we do this again. It's a labor of love, kind of a fun hobby. But the fact that you guys support us is very much appreciated. So I think all the other super chats we have are on the TCU versus Alabama comparison. I don't know if we wanted to get to that now or if we want to hold on these for the playoff, but I'll let you decide that one.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more, just kind of general discussion. Because I've actually got you said 6, my 6 and 6. I've already got those ready, but I
challenge Daniel that we should do what we think the playoff top 6 should be, and we should also talk about what we think it will be when the committee's finalized. And I want to talk about the conference championship games too, obviously. But
and let's get into that a little bit. I thought that, and we've got a really good friend of the program that messaged us during on Twitter at the end of the LSU Georgia game, and he said they had some really bad luck in that game. I don't disagree. I think, again, this is one where it was out of control early, but I think LSU, people are going to laugh at this. Like, I think LSU acquitted themselves rather well at the end of the day in this game. I feel like there's a lot that they can build off of. They ran into a little bit of a buzzsaw with some bad luck, but 30 points is nothing to sneeze at.
It's I think one of the most challenging things for people to understand in college football is the danger posed by a high talent team, even when they don't have a great win-loss record. And that's where I've said a lot. When I evaluate the quality of teams' wins and losses, I don't really care about the number of wins and losses the other team have. I care about how good the other team is. And I'll often point to like FEI rankings or SP Plus rankings or something like that, because you don't beat it doesn't really matter if a team's 8-1 or if they're 7-5, because the schedules are different, often very, very different. How they played, when they played, the quarterbacks were out, blah, blah, blah. I care about how good the team is. In LSU's case, I mean, they're a team that just wasn't consistent, but they are talented and they're capable of playing well. They had the A&M loss, which people love to mock them for, and it's a bad loss in a lot of ways. But, A&M was a top 5 team preseason for a reason. If they played up to their talent level, they were capable of beating a lot of teams. The defense had a lot of talent. The offense had been banged up for a while. Like when they lost to Auburn, which I've said before, I think is the big turning point for when A&M's just totally got viewed as being a dumpster fire. They didn't have A-Chain. They didn't have Muhammad. They're out basically all their best skill players on both sides of the ball. They were just now having to start the freshman quarterback, and they got time to gel. They got a bunch of all those skill players back healthy, and they were a rather different team when they played LSU, beat LSU. Now LSU sucks. That didn't mean there's way too many moving pieces here, way too many teams that have high talent and inconsistency to start drawing too many conclusions that LSU can't play anyone good ever. I think LSU was very capable of playing very good football. And what we saw in that game against Georgia, I think, was actually a pretty good puncher's shot from LSU. You saw really what they were kind of capable of. But I think what you also saw was what Georgia was capable of, because this really has been my mantra with them for 2 years now. People do not appreciate how effective that offense is. And in terms of a points per drive perspective, I think they were second or third in the country last year, and they're top 5 right now. They play slow, so they don't play a lot of drives, so the score doesn't get that high because they don't have a ton of tempo. But drive to drive, they score almost as much as anybody else in the country. Like they score more. I think they score more than Michigan does per drive, or they score more than Ohio. That's not shocking. They score more than I think it's like right at what Ohio State has over the course of the season. And they just aren't viewed that way, I think, because they go slower. And what you saw against LSU was, okay, if the other team's moving the ball and scoring, you start handing it back to them, that score mounts and mounts and mounts. And it's a mountain to overcome that and actually beat Georgia, no matter, even if the defense has taken a step or two back.
Yeah. And here's the thing. And this is why people hate that we're nerdy. So we're very chalk heavy, which is why we pump up the SEC maybe a little more than people want to hear. But LSU's schedule was, Josh, it was ridiculous. Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama. Now, they did get some luck with the home splits in terms of who was good this year. Florida State, they don't really they've been mocked for losing that Florida State game all year. Florida State turns out to be like a 9-3 team. And everybody, it's so funny that Florida State, losing to Florida State at 9-3 is some joke, but losing Kansas State at 9-3, oh, we got to put them in the playoffs. But what I think is funny, because you said something about the Pac-12, you weren't so sold on them. And here's a good example. LSU beat the crap out of Mississippi State. Well, they beat them 31-16, right? Mississippi State played at Arizona, beat them 39-17 in their own house. USC beat that Arizona team by 1 score. This is a team, this Mississippi State team, LSU gets no credit for beating them at all. None. And that's a team that's 3 touchdowns better than a team that almost beat USC. So that's what we talk about when it's like there's hidden challenges in playing in the Big Ten East and the SEC West. A lot of people are saying, who has Ohio State played this year? Well, crap, they had to play on the road at Penn State. Everybody's forgetting that. Who has Alabama played this year? Well, they played at Texas, at Ole Miss, at LSU, at Tennessee. That's an awfully tough schedule. So I think that in these teams that beat up on each other, they do have not so pretty win-loss records, but that doesn't mean they aren't good teams. And when you have to play them back-to-back and then you're not getting any credit for beating them, it's not entirely fair. Like Maryland is a decent team. They're not great, but they are a decent team that neither Michigan nor Ohio State got credit for beating. And that's there's some hidden challenges in these schedules that make it tough to evaluate to a TCU or USC.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's just there's not enough data points, but the way things panned out were rough. And I'm actually going to take this opportunity to go on a mini rant that I've been holding in for weeks.
Okay.
Daniel, we have in the past been very defensive of the committee, have we not? We've talked about the committee does a good job. They generally rank well. They're usually better than the AP poll. That's been a constant thing. Do you agree with me with my sentiment? This is the first year that I think the committee has done a very poor job.
Yes.
There are a lot of rankings right now that are reflective of the committee playing the AP game. I think a lot of committee members probably are just paying attention to the AP and coaches poll, and they're ranking purely off wins and losses. And if you look down, the last playoff rankings, and it's 0 loss, 0 loss, 0 loss, 1 loss, 1 loss, all your 2 losses, your 3 losses, your 4 losses, with just a couple exceptions. Washington and Tulane were the only ones out of order. They have not done that previously, which has been, I think, very consistent with the fact that they paid a lot more attention into where those losses came from and what they matter. Here, they are just ranking between people with the same number of losses. And it's frankly, it's screwed up. I have always said, because it's been very clearly true historically, the committee does not rank you based off things you haven't yet done, right? If you're, and the big thing is if you're leading your conference, you don't get a bump for leading your conference over another team that is already out of the conference, because you have not won the conference yet, right? It's the USC would be the example. You don't put USC ahead of Ohio State because you assume USC is going to win the Pac-12, because they might not, and they haven't earned that yet. That's not a win they have in their bracket. That is what the playoff committee did. I don't think there's any doubt that USC is going to fall behind Ohio State, but they should have never been there to start with, because their resume up until last week with 1 loss to Utah was absolutely not as good as Ohio State's with their 1 loss to Michigan. And I know it was a blowout. Michigan is a much better team than Utah, and Ohio State had looked much better over the course of the year. USC had not looked good over the course of the year. USC should have been behind Ohio State, and if they won the conference and Ohio State didn't, then you consider bumping them above. The committee did that all wrong. And I will say there's a lot in terms of when you talk ranked wins, it gets really screwy because a lot of Pac fans like to say, well, we've got so many ranked teams. We've got Utah ranked. We've got Washington ranked. We've got Oregon State ranked. Look, they're ranked because you got a bunch of teams that have 2 or 3 losses, and you got a bunch of teams that have 2 or 3 losses because, like you're saying, Daniel, you got other teams that Mississippi State can walk in and just blow out of the stadium. right? Teams that aren't really flirting with the rankings out of the other conferences. Most of the Pac-12 is really bad. And that means you've got teams with 1, 2, 3, 4 losses. That is not a problem if you're willing to look past things, if you're willing to actually consider how good the teams play, use your eyeballs, watch games. If you look at I'd be blunt. If you go look at the members of the committee right now, it's not a super impressive list. You're not going to recognize names on that list. I do not believe they're really watching games at a large number. I don't believe they really understand what's going on. And yeah, the rankings this year have been bad. And if there's one thing that makes me a little happy to have the expanded playoff, it's to this point, I felt like the top 4 was in pretty good shape because the committee had a good grasp of what they're doing right. This year, the committee has been terrible. And at least in an expanded playoff, when they screw up, they might accidentally get the right team in, or they'll have to in terms of a top 6, because my faith in them for the first year, and people talk about them historically, they've been good up to this point. This is the first year when if you look at them 1 to 25, I just think there's a lot of teams that shouldn't be ranked where they are.
Yeah, they really painted themselves in the corner in that what you don't want to do is put yourself in a position to have to punish a team in most cases for losing a conference championship game relative to someone who is sitting at home. But what you also don't want to do is give them credit for that win preemptively and then have to back them out. And that's what they forced themselves to do with Utah and maybe TCU. I don't think they will, but like that's the problem with like, and the other thing is like, I feel like everybody treated TCU this year as a team that isn't that great, and we're really going to punish them when they lose. Josh, this is the feeling I've had all year. Is everybody kept waiting, all the voters kept waiting for TCU to confirm what we felt about them with our eyeballs, and once that happened, they're going to drop them, heavy and kind of make up for all those close wins against backup quarterbacks. Now everyone has painted themselves in a corner in such that they can't do that with TCU because now it's the last game of the year, even though it shouldn't matter when that win or loss happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And so TCU's going to be the big example. I don't know exactly how the stuff's going to shake out, but we'll talk about that. I think that's probably how we'll end the stream. But I just wanted to get that ran in because for all our defense at times of the playoff committee, I do think they screwed it up this year. And a lot of what gets talked about in terms of teams and resumes, people talking about ranked teams, ranked wins. Look, having ranked wins only matters if the rankings are worth a crap. Frankly, I don't know that they're worth a crap this year. And let me just to say why I'm getting that from. You've got I don't know, Washington sit there at number 12 and LSU's at 14th with 9-3. Why is Washington 10-2? Well, LSU did lose to Florida State to open the year, though. Florida State themselves is 13th in the country. And by the way, I pointed this out in terms of FEI, Florida State is rated higher than any team in the pack. So that was a close loss and an early loss, but people talked about like USC, Alabama in the opener with you on Twitter, I think. Yeah, 52-6 to Alabama in the opener isn't quite the same as a last-second loss to a team that's actually kept higher ranked than you, but that's a different conversation. Washington lost to Arizona State. The other loss was to UCLA. What's their best win? Well, Michigan State turned out to be terrible. Stanford turned out to be terrible. So I guess their best win is probably the three-point win over Oregon. And beyond that, 3-point win over Oregon State. They beat Cal by a touchdown. There's not a lot there. There's just not. Because they didn't play USC and they didn't play Utah. So we kind of have Washington sitting there at 10-2, I think, by virtue of the fact that they had a schedule. That loss, that loss to Arizona State, that's not better than the loss to Texas A&M, really. So when you compare the other losses they have, they just didn't have a schedule that was anywhere near as hard as what LSU had, but they're sitting there at 12 and LSU at 14, because their schedule was a lot easier with an equally horrible loss. And the committee I need to end the rant, but the committee has not done a good job this year. And a lot of these rankings are very superficial.
Well, and that's why it's the same way that Tulane is ranked. They're going to be in the top 15 in the next rankings. And people kept coming at me like Kansas State's loss at home to Tulane isn't that bad, or it's not a bad loss. Tulane's ranked. They're ranked higher than any of Alabama's wins. Texas would be a 3-touchdown favorite over Tulane, probably. I don't think Tulane's terrible, but look, they were just barely better than a lot of terrible G5 teams. They lost to a 6-6 Southern Miss team that Miami beat by 3 touchdowns. And so we are so hyper-focused on win-loss records, and that's what's happened in the Pac-12. Somebody argued with me on Twitter that the Pac-12 is better than they have been in the past. And I said, the Pac-12 is 4-8 against Power 5 opponents out of conference, 4-8, and they lost to Florida. Their champion lost to Florida. Oregon lost by 46 points. They were like 0-3 against the SEC this year. And they followed up and said, well, look at all these Pac-12 wins that the Pac-12 has. The Pac-12 has to win in those games. They're going to go 50-50 like they have to. Beating teams within your conference is not evidence that your conference is better. It just isn't. It's pure math. We got to get going on this. And Josh Natter with a super chat, and I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it said, Vandy beat Florida, who beat the Pac-12 champ. Vandy should win the Pac-12. Also, everyone liked the video. And look, when I made the comment about Mississippi State going out and killing Arizona, it was not to do a transitive property thing. But I think it's telling that LSU also beat Florida, beat them soundly at Florida. This is a team that, Utah went to Florida and lost. Utah is going to play in the Rose Bowl. LSU is going to be ranked behind Tulane. This is what I'm saying. It's like the teams in the Pac-12 that can lose to a Florida or get blown out by Mississippi State, those are credited wins, to your point, in terms of ranked wins because your schedule is clean when you beat Arizona, right? You get credit for that. But LSU doesn't get credit for that because they also have to play Tennessee and they have to play Georgia and Alabama and all these teams. I'm going to end my part of the rant too.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's go for about 5 minutes each if we can and walk through the various conference championship games, and then we'll try to end with our playoff ranking. And again, I'll probably there's some playoff selection super chats maybe we can touch on, but the other ones, we're still holding them. We got them saved, and we'll touch on the rest of them then. But let's just walk through all the conference championship games and our thoughts on them. I don't know. Maybe we can, if you guys like some of them, maybe we'll spin them off into separate videos. But let's try to touch on them all individually, starting with the ones that were already played, moving on to the ones that are going now.
USC and Utah was interesting to me because it's another Lincoln Riley team that struggles with physicality. They already lost to Utah once earlier this year. There's a lot of things that we've punished Alabama for this year in terms of being a finesse team, and that's where they're going. And that's the problems we see with USC. I do think Caleb Williams getting hurt was a problem, but USC couldn't tackle. So if they won that game, they were going to have to win it in scoring every single possession. So I don't think they win that game anyway if he's not hurt. Obviously, that threw a wrench in it, but I am glad that at least USC, maybe not TCU, maybe we have to have TCU in there, but at least USC, I hope, got exposed before they took a playoff slot instead of taking a playoff slot like a 2019 or 18 Oklahoma.
Yeah, and I think you could see from USC where they were good and where they were bad over the course of the year. Caleb Williams did end up at 8.9 yards per, threw for over 350 yards, had a high QBR. Now, Cam Rising threw for about 9.1 yards per. Something that bugged me in that game a little bit is I kept talking about how Caleb Williams was hurt, and that was sort of implying that's why they lost the game. Nobody really wanted to sort of acknowledge the fact, right, that Cam Rising's been hurt since the USC game. They also didn't have the ability to run the quarterback the way they wanted to because Cam Rising had been really, the driving force of their run game until later in the year. But the difference in that game was the defenses. And USC played better defense in the first half than they had, by and large, for most of the year. And they got a little worn down, and then the tackling just went to crap. They were just bouncing off guys, and there's a size issue and a physicality issue, which we knew they were going to have going into the year based off their roster. They didn't really reload defensively that well. But effort execution technique was terrible. Like they're tackling high, trying to tackle with their arms, bouncing off guys. If they had, they're struggling to stop Utah's tight ends. And a point we made is like, if you think this is bad, I did not want to see them. I mean, maybe I did kind of want to see them try to tackle Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington from Georgia. Because I saw Darnell Washington at 6'7" hurdle a human being in the Oregon game. And I'm pretty sure Georgia could have just thrown a bubble screen to either one of them on every play, and we just would have watched them carry all the USC defenders to the end zone. So I think USC is a good team, but again, this is what we talk about all the time. You start getting in this top 5, top 6 level, it's a very, very different ball game. And these things that you struggle with or get exposed on by like a Utah, I'm glad it happened now, because if you'd actually made it to the playoff, you would have played a team that could do everything else that Utah can't do, and they could do that thing that exposed you twice as well. And it just wouldn't have been enjoyable. It would have been like a lot of those Oklahoma games were, and frankly, what a lot of the 12-team playoffs are going to be. It just would have been brutal. I did think USC, like, I don't know. I thought they played well. I thought they had a lot of athleticism. I think they would have matched up with a lot of teams in a lot of ways. You could tell from their passing game, with the receivers and the quarterback play they had, it was very good. I kind of hate that Williams did get banged up at the end, and I'm not sure how that's going to reflect on him. But just overall, it really was just like core strength and talent. USC just has way too many holes.
So with TCU and Kansas State, we both picked TCU, I think, tight. I don't remember what the model had. Maybe you can look that up. But Vegas, I think the open was TCU was laying 2, and by the kickoff, Kansas State was favored by 1, which is a pretty big swing. But it was interesting that this is a team that TCU beat by 10 points in the regular season, and the general sentiment was that TCU's probably, not going to win the game, which is interesting. And there's some people getting at me in the chat saying the TCU slander is ridiculous or whatever. Again, TCU played what I think is not a great schedule, and they had 5 one-score wins and a loss. They had one-score wins against some bad teams, including SMU, who's a 7-5 G5 team. So the thought is, okay, what if they had to go on the road and play Tennessee? What if they had to play LSU on the road? What if they had to play Georgia today? Would they have gone to overtime with Georgia? I don't think they would have. That doesn't mean TCU is a bad team. And I think that if we're talking about most deserving, they belong in the playoffs. But Josh, somebody said this in the chat. I said this to you earlier today. I have the feeling that TCU 2022 is Cincinnati 2021. The team that we all know doesn't really belong in a 4-team playoff, certainly in a 12-team playoff, in a 4-team playoff, in a competition to determine who's the most elite team in the country, which is different from a competition of who's had the best win-loss record or the best season. And I think that's a great analog. I could be proven wrong, but I think that this is 2021 Cincinnati. It's sort of not a lifetime achievement award, but kind of a wink and a nod. We're going to let you in, but we know you're not going to win it.
Yeah, I'm actually I think I'm gonna one-up you on this in examples. I think they're 2018 Notre Dame. In 2018, everyone knew Notre Dame had a minimal shot at actually winning the title. They ended up being ranked 3rd because they had 0 losses. Oklahoma with 1 loss was behind them at 4th. Georgia at 2 losses was kept out. Ohio State at 1 loss was kept out at 6th. Every one of those teams would have beaten Notre Dame. Georgia would have probably thumped them. Oklahoma would have beaten them. Ohio State would have beaten them that year. Michigan would have beaten them that year, and they were undefeated, so they got in. And they needed to be in because they were undefeated. The schedule wasn't so bad to not put them in, but we all kind of knew they didn't belong. And that game, it was sort of a game from the jump where you could tell they didn't really need to be there. So Clemson got up on them pretty good and just sort of bombed away and put them away, and it didn't really look like they were trying. So, I think that's the best comparison in my opinion.
There's a note about TCU's strength of schedule that's floating around, and I want to address this because yes, Sagarin I think has them number one, and the note is they have the highest strength of schedule of any team in the top four. The difference is how strength of schedules are done, and
I lost your audio.
oh, I hit mute. Okay, so Sagarin is what is the likelihood of making a bowl, right? So how likely are you to go 6-6, or the average team to go 6-6 against your schedule? So if you play a bunch of 6-6 teams, your schedule is actually really high because a lot of teams have like, G5s, FCS, things like that. That is not the model for strength of schedule to basically go undefeated is what the strength of schedule metric they use for playoff teams, or should use. Because if you had Georgia on your schedule but had to go undefeated, you could play 11 winless teams, 11 teams that went 0-12. But with Georgia on your schedule is actually harder than a schedule of 12 teams that went 6-6. But it would be number one in Sagarin.
Yeah, and I'll give you guys the actual numbers on this. So in Sagarin, TCU going into championship week was 21st in the country in strength of schedule. And that was higher than any of the other teams that were major playoff contenders. Like Michigan was 56th, Ohio State was 44th. Interestingly, Texas was third in that metric. Kansas State was ninth. It reflects really there's two things at play there. One is the point he just made, that Sagarin is all about the difficulty of an average college football team. And when I say average, it's like the 50th best college football team to make a bowl with your schedule. And it's really hard if you're the 50th best team in the country to play in the Big 12, do a round robin schedule with 9 Big 12 teams, and make a bowl game. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily hard for an elite team to go undefeated with that schedule, because there's not necessarily that many high level teams. There are a lot of good ones, not high level. This is the same issue we talked about for several years with Notre Dame, because their all name schedule's been pretty similar. FEI has a different strength of schedule ranking, which is an elite strength of schedule based off the number of losses an elite team would average to have versus that schedule. In that metric, TCU is the worst of all the playoff contenders. They're 43rd. Tennessee is 9th. Alabama is 14th. Michigan's 32nd. Ohio State's 29th. Georgia's 33rd. So when you look at it from the perspective of how many losses would the average elite team have, Alabama has by far the most difficult schedule. TCU had the easiest schedule. So there's a huge, normally we see something of a difference in this calculation, but this year it's particularly glaring. Alabama had about 5 games this year that were quite doable, right? That you just kind of threw away, didn't pay attention to. The Vandies, some of their out-of-conference games. Their 6 hardest games are brutal. And that's the part that matters really for an elite team in making a playoff. And so, yeah, the strength of schedule calculation between different teams is tough. And this is a good chance for me to roll in a couple super chats. I'm gonna hit it. Mike Farino said, "Here's my stance. TCU and Alabama have a common opponent. TCU won by more and has one less loss. Alabama doesn't really have a flagship win to propel them." And that's getting to what I was just saying, that it's one, TCU won by more. They were both a 1-score game versus Texas. It was just close, slightly closer in Alabama's. And the other is one less loss. But again, the overall like high level wins, it really comes down to like what kind of metrics you're looking at, how it's calculated. I think a lot of metrics, and a lot of metrics are tough too. And this is the last thing I wanted to touch on at this point. There is good reason to believe, I've seen this several times in recent years, metrics have a blind spot for the Big 12. I don't know why it is. I think it has to do with how isolated the conference is, because they play 9 conference games. A lot of them play in FCS, and then they often don't play a Power 5 out of conference in the other 2. Your metrics are all based on playing each other. And for some reason, a lot of metric systems like them as a group. And there's not any real touch points with other conferences, so the bias is kind of weird. There's no reason to think that they're better than another conference if you haven't seen them play the other conference. And remember, computers can't see how big, fast, strong you are. They are just looking at stats on a paper. And so there's kind of a weird bias there. It seems like metrics seem to guess that they're better. And you see that right now, like in FEI, Kansas State is 7th, Texas is 6th, the TCU is 8th. It seems to trickle down. So that's a pretty big effect. And again, Barkawa Nabali said, you guys keep saying we need a cross-conference data point. We have that. Bama beat Texas backup quarterback by 1 point. TCU beat the same stadium by 7. Again, same point. And that's,
Tulane and
it was
Kansas
the one.
State have a common opponent too. I mean, I don't like. I think it's a little unserious to make that point because, okay, TCU also beat SMU by 8 points. Like, I don't think that you can boil it down to one. Those two games were the circumstances were so different, and that's like, I'm gonna have TCU ahead of Alabama, but that's
even then, if you try to break it down, it does start to fall apart when you look at the individual stats of those games because Texas shut down TCU, even worse than they shut down Alabama. Really, Alabama struggled. They struggled with Ewers early. I don't know that they were necessarily prepared out of the gate, and Alabama had secondary players in that game that they ended up benching and replacing. Eli Ricks had a back injury to start the year, so he wasn't playing. They had another JUCO guy in. They pulled him in that game. We've talked about this ad nauseum because it comes up a lot. And they solidified as they went on. Alabama, by the end of the year, was a much better team. Really, by week 3, was a much better team than they were in week 1. They have a lot of young receivers, blah, blah, blah. Texas got worse over the course of the year. They regressed considerably. I don't know if it was stuff on tape or what. So it breaks down in a lot of respects. But, yeah, I get that one common data point, but if that's your common data point, at best it just says Alabama is no worse than TCU, which doesn't necessarily help the argument.
Yeah, and are we gonna ignore the fact that like there was tape on Ewers by that point? Like, I don't. None of the people who are talking about common data point, if they had to bet their mortgage, would pick TCU on a neutral field versus Alabama. I'm leaning more towards best season versus best team, and that's why I'm going to put TCU in. But nobody would do that. Nobody would pick TCU over Alabama. So that's a little unserious. Okay, next up, let's talk. We can talk SEC real quick, or actually we have talked about it a little bit. We're running out of time, but that game to me just solidified Georgia as who we like. This is what we always talk about because there's a difference in picking apart a team that consistently struggles throughout their schedule, like 2012 Notre Dame is a team that's come up in the chat. Like, they didn't belong in the national championship game. Yes, they had a clean win-loss record, but they barely beat and went to overtime with some like bad teams. That's different from a team that when they need to flex their muscle, they can, but got a little sleepy against a couple of teams. Georgia is one of those teams. And that's why everybody talks about Georgia versus Kent State, which they won by, I think, 3 touchdowns. Georgia versus Missouri, which was a scary one for them. That's a different Georgia than Georgia in championship mode. And that's the same way that, like, I think that because there's more parity this year, we don't appreciate that, like, the Alabama teams and the Clemson teams who just work their schedule to the end of the year. But we're now getting Georgia in flex mode, and now we're about to give them a month to prepare for their opening round opponent. And I think we're going to see a little bit more of that.
Yeah, and even then it was kind of silly. Like, I pointed this out a bunch. Georgia had a 2-score lead over Kent State by like the middle of the second quarter, and it was never less than that. Kent State hung around in the game, and it was sort of people were paying attention because they kept scoring and they kept pulling back to 2 to 3 scores. But it was 2 to 3 scores the whole time. It wasn't like Kent State was at any point in a position to even take the lead late in the game. Now, Missouri kind of was, and that was a scare. But Missouri was a team a lot like Iowa that had a really good defense and gave a lot of people fits in the SEC because when your defense is that good, if the other team screws up enough, you can get in a close game and you have a potential to win. And I think people really struggle with those teams and trying to understand what they mean. Like, I don't think they're usually very good teams. Texas A&M has often fallen in that category. Iowa's in that category. Those are games where they are not good teams. They often shouldn't be ranked that high. But I also understand, again, you play a quality. You beat or lose to a team of a certain quality. You don't beat or lose to a certain record. And Missouri is a low record team, but actually has some good qualities that can challenge you. And those were just happened to be a couple games where Georgia turned the ball over a bunch. But it's judging a team by their two most disinterested games where they had a lot of, like, I would say, they're not luck based, but sort of like random bad luck, bad performance based stats in games they didn't really care about and still won. I mean, give me a break. They played a lot of really good teams too, and like Tennessee and some others, and they destroyed them. So it just doesn't really hold a lot of water in my view.
So got to give a shout out to Lauren, who's probably not having a great day or night right now, and I'm sorry for that. An apology is in order because Lauren is a friend of my wife's, and she got on us for not previewing the Clemson North Carolina game. Segue alert. But Josh, I don't know that it's totally fair because North Carolina's defense isn't very good. But man, the people that have been barking about DJU starting for 2 years now, when it's clear to everybody but Dabo that he doesn't belong as QB1, Klubnik has been straight dealing tonight. And that there's no way this hasn't shown up in practice.
Yeah, well, there's going to be a lot of people. I was looking to chat to see when you're on, probably watching that Michigan Purdue game, and they don't realize that Clemson is now up 39-10. Klubnik is 15 of 18, 233 yards, 12.9 yards per attempt. They pulled DJU because I think they failed to get a first down in the first two drives, went 2 of 5. He threw for 10 yards passing. But this comes back to something I made a lot of Texas fans mad early in the year because I was critical of Monsieur Quinn Ewers. I think Klubnik has a similar issue, which is super talented guy, top-level arm talent, athletic. If he has a play in front of him where he's got a receiver open to deliver to, he looks great. And if he can run around and scramble and there's something immediately available, he can look good. If he has to operate in the pocket and make progressions, he's a very different player from what I've seen. Ewers was like the extreme on that from what I had seen on tape even early. Even like the blowout in Oklahoma, I flagged it, where he wasn't actually operating well within the offense. Same thing, Anthony Richardson last year, we flagged early on where I noted he had some big plays in those like blowouts like Florida Atlantic and whatnot. They weren't starting him. People were mad. But saying, yeah, he had a big play here where he ran for a touchdown for 80 yards, but he also had a wide open first read for 30 plus or a touchdown that he just didn't see. And then he took a cat corner blitz that he had to evade, which caused him to run, which he should have shifted protection for. There's a lot of stuff like that. So I think what you're seeing from Klubnik is his ceiling, but I'm always very skeptical too, because this gets to your point a second ago. North Carolina's defense is really bad. And when your defense is really bad, it stresses quarterbacks in a different way, where I think sometimes a guy like DJU will miss a wide open receiver 1 out of 3 times. His consistency mechanically is really bad, but he does kind of know how to operate the offense. So they've been better this year in that regard, and he can make throws against high-level competition. He's just going to be constantly inconsistent. But if you're playing a team where everybody's open every time, you want the high talent guy, even if he's young, even if he doesn't understand the offense, because he's going to know what his first read is, and he can throw the ball to him, and he'll light them up. And I think that's what you're seeing with Klubnik. I just don't I'm really always hesitant with these guys to take those performances and translate them to what they're going to be later. But I will say, to sign it off and segue you to maybe close that point, I'll be honest, for my part, I've never pushed for us to cover a whole lot of North Carolina games or Clemson games because I kind of knew what Clemson was. I watch them a lot. I have a lot of Clemson friends up here in D.C. I got a buddy right now. I had to miss the championship game because he's at drill, unfortunately. And I also watched a lot of North Carolina games, and I kind of knew what they were too. And they were sitting there with one loss. And again, paper tigers that didn't have difficult schedules. North Carolina still finally had to play a Clemson, which I think they are what they are, and they're getting run out of the stadium. So I think that's just sort of the reality of where they are relative. Where Clemson still is relative to the ACC, maybe where the ACC is relative to everybody else.
And real quick on the Purdue Michigan game, like Purdue just took a sack, ended up taking the points on the field goal at 16-8. One interesting note, though, we talked about coming into this game that Purdue couldn't run the ball, terrible running team, and that's played out throughout the course of this game, 1.8 yards per carry. But one thing we noted was Purdue is like 90th in the country in yards per attempt, and Aiden O'Connell has actually been pretty successful tonight. 52 yards on 32 attempts, 8.4 yards per. That's pretty good. So I do wonder how Michigan would fare. Like I know that they held Ohio State down, but Ohio State at some point in that game got into got to throw the ball a lot mode. I do wonder how they do against an efficiency monster passing offense that could actually run the ball. I feel like Michigan's got pretty good game control right now. Maybe not a whole lot on this game. Even if they lose, I'll be honest, I got them second. Even with a loss, I've got them second in my final playoff rankings. Anything else on this one before we get into our rankings, Josh?
Yeah, I think I would just touch on that O'Connell at 8.4 yards per, this is going to be if this stands or he maintains that average, it'll be his third highest performance against an FBS team this year. And yes, they did play an FCS in week 2, by the way, the mighty Big Ten.
I was told only SEC teams play, and they play 3 or 4 a year each team. So I don't know.
Yeah, I had to throw that in there.
You might need to check your sources.
Yeah, we see that all the time. But yeah, it's not been a great performance in that regard. He has played very well, I will say. And when you watch a game, you can see when there's times when a quarterback's throwing to wide open guys. We talked about TCU, I feel like, in Kansas State pretty sporadically. So let me tie it in there. The TCU Kansas State game, there were a lot of plays for both teams where they were throwing to guys with 7 yards of separation. Like TCU, their offense has a lot of high-level skill player talent. They are very fast. They're tall. I've talked about this a lot. Their skill players are as good as any of the major teams for the most part. When you talk Georgia and Ohio State, you kind of get in a rarefied realm. But for the major conferences, they'd hold up week to week with everybody. But Kansas State's defense was letting them run free. Like there were guys all over the field just running free constantly. And it was just a matter of whether Duggan saw him or threw to him. And frankly, I was a little unimpressed when I started to really pick at it and look at different views, because I realized Duggan looks great because he has somewhere to throw almost every play and usually multiple options. Kansas State was the same way. When they were completing passes, I mean, they had some good throws, both of them, don't get me wrong, but they had multiple good options most plays. And even when they're making tough throws, they often had an easier one. O'Connell has not been in that boat. He's been throwing tight in coverage. He's having to throw away from DBs. It's not been easy for him in this game. So even though, it's easy for me to critique Michigan, but they didn't make it easy on him. I think he's playing better this game than he has for the most part over the course of the year. More than anything, they're well prepared. They're motivated. The unfortunate thing for them, I'll say in this, is just like it has been all year. Michigan is old school ball control, anaconda offense. It's really hard to play these games and run away with it. And as I say that, JJ McCarthy throws, and this is my thing. McCarthy's stats, when he does well, he's throwing to wide open guys, and he just threw a really stupid interception. Evaluating quarterbacks is tough. And yeah, I think all of these games you got to take with a bit of a grain of salt because of that.
All right. This is going to be fun. I'm noting it an hour and 5 minutes into this that we're doing a kind of a little bit different. We're not doing a top 10 this week. Thank God, Josh, that we only have to pick 6 teams instead of 10, because picking the 10th best team in the country this year or this week would be awful. What we're going to do, y'all, is we're going to pick, Josh and I are going to do our own top 6 rankings, and then what we think the committee's top 6 will be. Josh, do you have yours ready?
Just about. If you start, I'll be ready by the time you go.
So I'm going to do my top 6. You can do your top 6, and then we'll kind of talk through what we think the top 6 for the committee is going to be. I've got Georgia shocking. I've got Georgia number 1. They handled their business today. 50 points on a talented, maybe not great LSU defense. I've got Michigan number 2, even if they lose tonight, because I think they earned it in the regular season. I think that my thing is the same criticism you had earlier about the committee. You should set these teams up to rank them in such a way that they can play their way up with a great performance against a great team in a conference championship game, but not necessarily play their way out of a position relative to teams that are sitting at home. And the committee did not do that. But for me, I would do that. I've got Michigan number 2, win, lose, or draw, because right behind them, I've got Ohio State. And I think that the loss today for TCU, it was a close loss. I think it was close, which kept Alabama out. If that game would have ended up the way it was trending and Kansas State won that game 42-20, I would have put Alabama in the playoffs for sure. But in the least, I'm sticking by what I said earlier today. Everybody wants to talk about Ohio State's margin of loss against Michigan. Nobody wants to talk about Ohio State's margin of victory against every other team they played this year, including a double-digit win on the road at Penn State, who I've got in my rankings. While TCU had 5 one-score wins against multiple backup quarterbacks. I think there's part of a schedule that if you have to play a lot of it where there's good teams back-to-back, even if they're not elite, it makes it really challenging. And TCU, an 8-point win over SMU, that's a team that Ohio State's going to beat by 40 points. It just is. So I've got Ohio State ahead of them because I think it's fair. It's totally fair to ding them for that 22-point loss at home against Michigan. But you got to do it. You got to look at it for everybody else. You can't just judge one team in a silo. I've got TCU number 4 ahead of Alabama. Alabama fans are going to be mad at me. I do think Alabama is a better football team than TCU. But look, LSU, they had no business losing to LSU. They had no business not scoring in the second half against Mississippi State or having a 1-score win against Ole Miss. I don't think these are great teams. And Alabama has a overall good season, not great season. And I'm not entirely sure that Alabama doesn't have the same or worse record as TCU if they swap schedules. Now, I think TCU loses 2 games with Alabama's schedule, but I'm not sure Alabama goes undefeated in the regular season in the Big 12 this year. They've got more talent than anybody. But, Josh, they don't have the coaching, and I think we're going to see a change in that offseason. Finally, at number 6, I've got Penn State ahead of Tennessee, and I do think part of this is what the committee said in the past they do. I don't know that they're doing it this year, but they have said in the past that they weigh significant injuries. They said it the very first ranking they did in 2014, they considered injury. I'm considering it here. I've got Penn State ahead, and also Penn State, after their loss, killed everybody. Nobody got close to them, and that deserves some credit. So I've got Penn State number 6, and not just because Stephen Light is my homeboy. Give me your top 6.
So this is my top 6, right? What I would personally pick. Is that right?
Correct. Then we'll
You're
talk
muted.
through what we think the committee will do together.
Yep. Just double checking. This is going to sound familiar. My number 1 is Georgia. I don't think there's really any question to that with where they're at, how they played today, how they've done over the course of the season. My number 2, as you said, win or lose, is Michigan. And the reason for that is, worst case, they're going to have 1 loss compared to Ohio State's 1 loss. They played Ohio State. They beat Ohio State. They really only have a loss by virtue of the fact that they would have had to play this game. Now they're winning right now, and I don't expect them to lose. But even if they do, still going to have Michigan at number 2. They're not going to get blown out at this point in the game. But certainly with a win, they have to be number 2. And let me just take a second to note there. People get confused on how you draw this. And look, these are such fine subjective lines that it's never completely, utterly consistent or clear. But the way I look at it in terms of not punishing a team for playing the extra conference championship game, we talked about this earlier. You go watch our full live show video if you're watching a cut up of this. It really basically comes down to the fact that, is that conference championship game confirming or telling us something we didn't know? Or is this just an extra loss by the virtue of you had an extra opportunity to lose? And this will be just an extra opportunity to lose situation. And I've also often said, once you get multiple losses, that head-to-head thing starts to really go away, because that extra data point can move the needle way past the head-to-head. The head-to-head really only works when you're talking about a single loss. either in the conference champions or conference standings or national standings in terms of overall losses. So Michigan 2, I have Ohio State 3. I agree with you. I mean, I think, and this gets back to the point I just made, Ohio State lost to Michigan in, whether you want to call it a blowout or not, I mean, it was a competitive game until relatively late, but I also think they got kind of outclassed and out-physicaled, and you've got to throw that into perspective. But what I saw from Ohio State over the course of the season was a lot of dominance. Like you said with the Penn State game, there's something to be said when you walk out there and you walk away with 2 scores over Penn State. There's something to be said with the way they put away a lot of teams like Iowa. And we did not see that much from TCU. And TCU was undefeated in the regular season, unlike Ohio State. They have an extra win over Ohio State. But again, this gets into the realm of, I think that conference championship game really just confirmed to me what I already thought was the case, that TCU was a team that was just a little bit better, and they were on a run and they won their games. And yep, I'm all for that. I think that is something that has to creep in. It's why I have TCU number 4, but it also kind of limits them. And our model last week had TCU 28, Kansas State 24. And that was a signal of the fact that even though TCU was undefeated, they were just marginally better than the other teams in their conference. And so I think you have to rank them number 4 because they did go undefeated. And to your point, I can't say that Alabama would have gone undefeated with the same schedule, as inconsistent as they were this year. They had all the talent in the world, but they did not play anywhere near that potential. And it wasn't just inconsistency. They were consistently inconsistent. Like, they were consistently not performing to the capability. TCU was kind of maxing it out in every game. They were consistently good at every team relative to their talent level. And you've got to reward that. So I can't do it over Ohio State, who only has the same 1 loss, just like TCU does. Neither one of them's a conference champion. TCU is not even a divisional champion because they threw away divisions. But Alabama, who's my number 5 team, I've got no reason to think that they wouldn't have dropped a game with TCU schedule. They almost lost to Texas, just like TCU did. They struggled with a lot of teams that weren't particularly good. They just haven't been dominant all year. And when you throw in the fact that they've got 2 losses, they've got to be there. If they had 1 loss, and even if that 1 loss was LSU and that put LSU in the conference championship game over them, I would absolutely have Alabama over TCU, because I believe if Alabama is a better quality team than TCU. But my view of best team is a team that is least likely to lose in a given week, is the best way I put it. Sometimes being the best average quality, overall quality, doesn't mean you're less likely to lose, because you might also be very inconsistent. Deviation versus average quality mean. Alabama just hasn't been very, very consistent. And my 6th team is, like you, Penn State. And same sort of calculus, the same calculus I think the committee often has talked about. I struggle with this, with Penn State versus Tennessee, and there are going to be a lot of people probably that go back and forth on this one, and I think it probably with good reason. Penn State has 2 losses to high-quality teams, to Michigan and Ohio State. Michigan game was a total blowout. Ohio State game was a lot closer, but still ended up being by a good margin. But outside that, what's their best win? I mean, blowing out Auburn wasn't anything special. They didn't really hold up in SEC play either. I don't know. I mean, you look down the rest of the record, or rest of that conference record. I mean, is it like Maryland? I mean, you beat Purdue, but you beat them by 4. So I'm not really sure what it is. And with Tennessee, who's the other option for me with 6th, yeah, they have a terrible loss to South Carolina, and a South Carolina team that they punked Clemson the next week. So they clearly were playing good football at the end. Much better football than they were earlier. Rattler is a 5-star for a reason, and he actually played like it for once. But their wins over Alabama, LSU, Kentucky, Missouri, Florida, Pitt, even, I mean, they beat a lot of pretty good teams. They beat a number of teams that are elite teams. The loss to Georgia was only 27-13. As much as they got beat up in that game, was only 2 scores. There are a lot of reasons to put Tennessee ahead. And I would say if Hendon Hooker had stayed healthy, I would have Tennessee over Penn State. But like you, without Hendon Hooker, if I was doing a playoff ranking, I cannot put Tennessee up there. And it's a shame, but that is not the same team without Hendon Hooker. They are not going to play at the same level. I've seen Joe Milton play before for them, and he's not anywhere near the same quarterback. So that's my top 6: Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, TCU, Alabama, Penn State. So my question back to you is, do you think there anything any changes with how the committee is going to rank the top 6 relative to what actually, as it turned out, both of us picked.
Yeah, I think the committee is going to flip Ohio State and TCU. They have said in the past that they try. If I think they have said they try to avoid rematches if they can. I think they'll flip it and say, TCU wasn't sitting at home, Ohio State was. I think it's garbage if they do flip it. Honestly, Ohio State would be favored on a neutral field. Ohio State is on quality a better team. Ohio State has played a tougher schedule. Ohio State has a much better win. I just don't know. Like, I don't know how you. The thing is, if you just look at win-loss records, okay. If you just look at the fact that TCU was playing and Ohio State wasn't, okay. TCU didn't have to play Michigan. TCU didn't have to play Penn State. So that's a little frustrating to me. I think that they're going to do that. And I'll say this, I don't know that Georgia needs any favors at this point, but I don't think it's fair that the number 1 overall seed will have to play the better team. And maybe TCU could beat Ohio State on a neutral field or whatever, but I think Ohio State is harder to prepare for. And I think they'll probably have Tennessee ahead of Penn State since they had Tennessee ahead last week, but I wouldn't have.
Yeah, it is interesting because they kept Tennessee ahead of Penn State. And I do agree with you. Because of that signals to me they're going to keep them ahead. And this gets to something I said. Again, you go back and listen to our live show. We've talked about a lot of different things in there, including the committee. The committee has not ranked consistent with their former criteria. They've talked about the effect of a quarterback loss in playoff rankings. That's keeping Tennessee higher throws that away. They've talked about how they only rank on what you've done to this point, but they ranked USC ahead of Ohio State when Ohio State had a better resume purely because USC was going to be in the conference championship game. They hadn't done that previously. They had only done that, only given you any sort of account for the fact that you're a conference champion leader or division leader or whatever once you actually won the division in the conference. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. But I do think you're right. I think Tennessee's probably going to be ahead of Penn State. I think TCU is going to be ahead of Ohio State because I think they're going to do – I think they may even admit it, but they're going to do gymnastics to avoid a Michigan-Ohio State rematch in round 1. They're going to try to get different matchups in round 1. So they're going to want to see Georgia have to play Ohio State so Michigan can play TCU to set up a potential Michigan-Ohio State game in the championship if they get there. The committee has said before that they were maybe amenable to that. And then they've said other times where, no, we're just going to rank 1 to 4, whoever's best to worst, it doesn't matter. I do think that they want to avoid rematches if all things are equal. And I think there's enough here for them to do some gymnastics and say, well, Ohio State and TCU is a really tough call, but we don't want to rematch in round 1. Then they're going to flip them. But I really think should be Ohio State 3 and TCU 4, but I doubt that's the way it's going to go. And I don't think there's any question in my mind. And do you agree with this, Daniel? I am closer to having Alabama over TCU than I have TCU over Ohio State in my head.
100%. 100%. And look, like Michigan fans will tell us we're a little too Ohio State biased or whatever. I'm not talking about Ohio State as a brand. I'm not talking about the logo. I'm not talking about their history. I'm talking about what they've done this year. They've played 2 teams better than anybody TCU's played. And I keep going back to this thing where they lost to a Kansas State team who I don't think is bad. And honestly, if Kansas State gets matched up with Alabama and Alabama has a bunch of opt-outs, I'm probably going to pick Kansas State. I think they've got a really good head coach. And I think they found something at quarterback. But Kansas State also lost to Tulane. They were a 3-loss team. And Penn State, their 2 losses were Ohio State and Michigan, and then they lost to Michigan. Ohio State did. I don't think that people appreciate that as much as they should.
Let me note one thing people bring it up in the chat, too, when you talk about rankings and where they go. People always want to say, well, the top team should get to pick who their opponent is. No coach, no AD wants to call out the team they play in round 1. They absolutely, positively do not want to say, yeah, we think TCU sucks. Let's play them. Like, that is a motivational landmine. It is a political landmine. They do not want that. Like, That is something that sounds good in a bubble, but in a reality where you actually have to play human beings and motivation, and you got to meet somebody at a conference. No, they do not want to do that. The system should not be built that way. Everyone would hate it that had to make that call.
Josh, a lot of people in the chat are telling us that we're TCU haters because Alabama almost lost to Texas. But I will turn immediately around and say that TCU should have lost to Baylor. Baylor should have slow played their subs. They needed a first down. Baylor needed a first down to end that game, and they went conservative, ended up punting, and lost the game by the skin of their teeth. And Baylor lost, I think, by double digits to Texas. So this round robin transitive property thing, again, I want to remind everybody TCU beat SMU by 8 points, and they played Colorado out of conference. So Alabama, before they even got into their SEC schedule, played TCU's best win on the road, like just out of conference, just as an extra. So I don't necessarily like. And look, y'all are calling us TCU haters. We have them in over Alabama. So both of us do. So I don't think that that's entirely fair. We're going to point out the flaws because that's what this whole thing is, because we don't have a 130 team playoff. We're going to call out both sides. But everyone in the chat, except for one or two people, would pick Alabama on a neutral field versus TCU with a month to prepare. And that's okay, though, because like we've both said, Alabama has been inconsistent. They have their coaches to blame, and they got to sit this one out. And I think that as a bit of a segue, I think this is putting Saban in a situation where he needs to show that he's got that killer instinct still, because I've heard a lot of talk from Saban this year of, hey, our goals are to beat Auburn, to win 10 games. I'm sorry, but that's BS. Like, you have built a standard at Alabama, and like winning 10 games, not beating any of the really good teams on your schedule, and not being dominant in any of your games, not putting offense and defense together in the same game once in a whole year, almost in 2 years. To me, I think Saban is complaining about fans, even though they just want him to hold his coaches to the same standard that he's given the fans to expect for the last decade plus.
Yeah. It's interesting because, and I know why you're bringing it up, because I think it's sort of an important point when you have this whole context about ranking in the playoff. If Alabama woke up tomorrow and played up to their standard with the talent they have on the field, they would probably be an even shot, I think, with Georgia to win the national title. Like, in terms of overall talent, offensive and defensive talent, that Alabama team should have been as good as Georgia. And they're not, and it's not close. And it's totally due to coaching. So, yeah, Alabama has – people talk about Ryan Day and whether they're slipping, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Ryan Day is gonna make the playoffs. They're going to make the playoffs this year. They had some slip-ups. They're still a very good team. They lost one game to their rival, who's also going to be a top 3 team. Alabama lost to a Tennessee team that is really good but not elite, and they lost to an LSU team that's really good but not elite in games where the defense looked atrocious or the offense looked really bad. Like, that's not Alabama's standard. It's not consistent. They're not playing up to their talent level, and they did that week in and week out. Almost lost to Ole Miss, almost lost to Texas. They have a lot of things to sort out. It'll be interesting to see where they land next year. They lose some pieces, but obviously they've got a ton of talent on that roster. They got a lot of guys returning too. So yeah, let me hit a couple more super chats so we can wrap this thing up. I just want to touch on everybody that did that. Killtech9 said, because college football is different than the NFL, the 4 best teams likely should be calculated based off some schedule performance parities. Analysis should be done on who played harder teams. I mean, I think that's all fair. I saw somebody recently say the best format, it may have been Bill Connolly that originated it, was 1/3 AP poll, 1/3 coaches poll, 1/3 metrics. I kind of hate that. The AP and the coaches poll are terrible. Even now, we were saying the playoff committee did a poor job. Their poor job was still better than the AP and coaches poll. The AP and coaches poll do really, really stupid things on the regular. And when I say that, I mean, they'll have 2 teams with the same record where this team just beat the team in front of them. Like, really freaking stupid stuff. And it's clear that a lot of not a lot of, I would say most of the media members, and Josh Pate would tell you the same thing, I think, on his show. If you watch his channel, they're just not watching it. They're not watching football. They don't dig in. They don't know who teams really played. They don't know how good those teams were. They don't know the circumstances, blah, blah, blah. So there's no good way to do it. And I will say, at least with the committee, the thing is you've got a small group and there's politics or whatever, but at least you got people in a room whose job is not to promote a narrative, but their job is to watch games and dig into all these teams and discuss them at length around a table. And even if you haven't really followed it yourself, someone else in the room has, and they're gonna give you the information to sort of force you not to do something really stupid. So I still think the committee, if at worst case it's 2/3 committee, 1/3 computer, but I still think the committee is better than the other options. And then Stephen Light said, "Isn't the expanded payoff a good way to sort out the conference comparisons, even it is the end of the season?" I think this year the answer to that would be kind of yes, and I think there's an argument for that the expanded playoff is going to help sort out this point. Our problem with this is pretty simple, and I'll say my piece, Daniel, and own it, and then maybe you can say yours if you agree with me or not. We are taken as SEC homers because we can, like Daniel said, we're chalk heavy. What does chalk heavy really mean? I pick the teams that are likely to win. We have a pretty good track record picking teams to win. Yeah, there's teams like Michigan we were off on this year, but there were a lot of other ones we were right on far more often than we were wrong. Favorites, better conferences do win more often than they lose. And for the past several years, the SEC has been better than the other conferences consistently. I think the Big Ten and the SEC this year are both better than the other conferences. I'm going to have to see that a little bit play out in the playoff. But my problem with this expanded playoff is, for everybody in this comment section, you say, I want to see the expanded playoff so that we can end this argument. It's like, okay, we do this. And what I think you're going to find is you're going to find a lot of these SEC teams, except in the ones like Tennessee that got injured, they're going to really just stomp teams like Washington. Like they're not going to stay on the field with Alabama, who's going to make the playoff. And so what you're going to end up with is 2-loss and 3-loss Ohio States and Alabamas that sort of float through, and Clemson maybe, that have a lot of talent, that you're going to find out, Alabama and LSU and Tennessee were a lot better than everyone but Ohio State and Michigan in the Big Ten, or were better probably than literally everyone in the pack. I think, bold take, I believe LSU would have won the Pac-12.
Maybe even Florida.
Yeah, like Florida beat the champion. So, you get shut up and you find out the SEC is better and maybe they're all blowouts. Is that going to be fun once you find that out? Once you realize round one is the SEC just stomping teams in other lesser conferences? And I remind you, people forget realignment's happening. USC and UCLA will not be Pac teams. They're going to be Big Ten teams. Oklahoma and Texas will be SEC teams. The Big 12 is going to have BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, UCF. Like, these conferences are not going to be on the same level most years. All those years where Oklahoma was the pallbearer, they're going to be they're going to be like SEC number 3 with Georgia and Alabama. And so you're going to have the best team in the Big 12. They're going to be years where they're 5th or 7th in the SEC is when they're going to land, and they're going to get beat up like it. And so we'll settle this argument by having a playoff that's going to have a bunch of blowouts, that's going to have a round 2 and 3 that's going to be all Big Ten and SEC teams, maybe one random team like a Clemson or somebody from another conference. And I think people are going to think it sucks. But, apparently we have to settle that argument by changing the whole system and proving the point, just to know what we've screwed up by what I think is a current system that favors teams like TCU, because for the same reasons we had them in our top 4, it rewards those teams for not losing to give them a shot at a shortened playoff, and that is the best chance TCU is going to have, because in a 3-round playoff with all these other teams, there's just absolutely no way this year's TCU would ever win a national title.
Yeah, and that's the thing that people need to realize is 2022 TCU, 2021 Cincinnati, they're still going to get in the playoffs in the future, but they're not going to make it into the top 4. And right now, because we're able to exclude an Alabama or a USC or a Tennessee or a Penn State, because we are so hyper-focused on win-loss records, they're able to get into the top 4 because what we've done is we're kind of treating all Power 5 schedules equally for the most part. If you go 12-1, 11-1, whatever, you're in. And so what that does is, and this is the best example I can think of, 2004 Auburn. Auburn fans, and I think Auburn claims a national championship for 2004. I know a lot of Auburn fans swear they would have won the national championship. They got left out. And I think USC absolutely murdered Oklahoma. The best thing that ever happened to 2004 Auburn was to not make the BCS championship game, because they get to play the what if game and we would have won and all that. It's a lot better to be able to play that game than to be proven that you had no business being there. And so what we've done for all these years after that with these smaller fields is we've given these teams opportunities to play the what if game. Well, if I would have gotten in there, it would have been that or this, and we would have been good and we could have won. 2015 Ohio State, who lost to Michigan State's backup quarterback, and 2017 Ohio State, who lost 2 games. But the thing is, what's going to happen instead of giving you that what if is you're going to be proven that you didn't belong there. And what's going to happen is 2021 Cincinnati is going to play 2022 Penn State, which isn't even a semifinal game, and they're going to get killed. And that's what's going to happen. And you're not going to have a Cinderella. You're going to have 2010 Alabama or 2017 Ohio State win a national championship because they've got all the talent. They've got 2 or 3 mulligans, and they can put it together with a month to get healthy and to prepare for other teams. And that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and let me try to take that and make a point and bring in this last super chat. The people are saying, well, so the worst thing you're talking about here is you're going to have to prove it on the field. Well, I think people that bring this smug point of, well, you're going to have to prove it on the field, all deep down believe that when you prove it on the field, that in truth, we're going to find out these Cincinnati's. And my example has always been UCF in 2017 when they played Auburn. There was an Auburn team with a hobbled Kerryon Johnson who was like 80% of their offense. That UCF team is going to go on a run. Well, what we prove on the field is that the better those SEC teams that you all think are overranked are actually better than everyone else. And I actually think right now, I actually think in many ways the SEC is underranked pretty consistently in the rankings. In terms of quality, almost every metric tells you that they're underranked right now. Okay, great. We've proved the SEC is better than the rest of college football. I don't think that's what you guys really want to see or have proven to you. And Javari Williams has a couple super chats, which were very generous, and I appreciate, and so I want to acknowledge him, and I appreciate the points he's making. He said, I wasn't going to give the super chat, but you guys got it wrong. 3 teams dominate the sport in terms of recruiting because of the 14 playoff. Put more teams in the playoff, and more teams can use that to recruit. Here's my rub. So the first off, Occam's razor. Expanding from the BCS to the playoffs concentrated power to a handful of teams. So if going to a playoff expanded concentrated power, why do we think expanding the playoff is going to dismiss that power and not concentrate it more? Because I think it's going to concentrate it more. Because if you're Ohio State and you're Alabama or you're Georgia, you're Clemson with that talent level, you are guaranteed to make it every year. They are not going to lose 4 games outside freak circumstances. So those teams are going to have every access. The other thing is I think if you look at the examples historically, Washington, when they made it 2016, you look at Michigan State 2015, I've gone back and charted it. There was no significant uptick in recruiting after they appeared and lost in round 1. And all these teams like UCF or Cincinnati that was building that go to the playoff or that were flirting with the playoff, I think they had a lot of success because they're flirting with it and they're seen as a growing program. If you actually go to the playoff and then you get thumped round 1, that little bit of mirage is going to go away and it's going to seen as a fluke where you didn't deserve to be there, 1. And 2, recruits don't even really care about that. They care about facilities. They care about coaches. These days they care about NIL, and the playoff doesn't do jack squat. People, if you want to talk money, understand most teams, in fact, almost every team loses money going to the playoff. It is not a revenue source that you make a few $1 million, and these programs, they generate about 120, 140 million dollars, some of them 150, 60. I think Texas and Ohio State, 150, 60 million dollars off their football program. This is just absolutely a non-factor. So it's not going to do anything in my opinion, to move that needle to parity. And I think it's just going to help concentrate it more.
And Josh, look at Luke Fickell. He just left a playoff team because that playoff appearance was charity, which 12-team playoff is going to have a lot of charity. He knows he's not going to win a national championship there, and he went to Wisconsin. Lincoln Riley went to a bunch of playoffs at Oklahoma, and he left Oklahoma. So not only is it a recruiting, like, I don't know that it's a huge recruiting boon to put Tulane in the playoffs this year. Like, because are you still, if you're a 5-star and Tulane gets in because there's a rule that the top G5 has to get in and lose by 40 points to Georgia, I don't know that you're picking Tulane next year instead of even a lesser team like Tennessee or Florida or Penn State. You're still going to pick one of those teams over Tulane. And what we've seen is exactly what we've said, Josh, that the Cinderella team is not going to be 2021 Cincinnati, who got in a 4-team playoff. The Cinderella is going to be 2010 Alabama, 2015 Ohio State, who have the talent and the roster to put it together when it matters most.
Yeah, and the Mike Farino sent a super chat, and it's a very good point. He said, just look at Michigan's recruiting this year, right? So last year, Michigan gets in the playoff, Ohio State doesn't. Ohio State's the traditional great recruiter. Do you know what their recruiting rankings are? Currently, Ohio State's 6th, Michigan's 21st. Michigan's recruiting actually fell off after making the playoff, as a lot of them do, by the way, because when you go to the playoff, you can't recruit as effectively around December, and it's actually more difficult. A lot of, like, Saban famously complained about making the playoffs when it started because it took him off the recruiting trail. So I think maybe it helps if you're a really enough like a Cincinnati and you show up, it helps relative to the teams in that bracket. But if you talk about playing with the elites, like, Cincinnati isn't poaching anyone from that Ohio State wants. And, if you're talking about getting in that realm with the teams that are regularly in there, the teams, it's not that they're in the playoff so they get talent. Let me end it this way. They get the talent so they're routinely in the playoff. And the point with the playoff is, if you're like a TCU and you want to make it in, the old system, the BCS system, was in many ways better, because if you went undefeated and no one else did, then we would put you top 2 and you had a one-off shot to win the title. Now, every time you give another mulligan, people were talking about in the chat, teams change and improve, and that's why playoffs important. Yeah, and it's true. And you know who improves and changes the most? The teams that have tons of 5-stars, because they're starting by far the youngest rosters, because they all go pro after their junior year, and they got the highest ceilings. And so they're always improving way more than everybody else. They usually have a lot more coaches. They have more analysts to improve. Again, that's why Alabama fell flat on their face this year. They didn't. And so those teams are always going to be the ones that benefit from this system as you expand the playoff. I truly believe that. And I don't want to disparage it too much, because I know Javari Williams was he made a point to do these super chats, and he's trying to support our channel. So hope you don't take it that way. I'm really trying to engage with their point and take it as seriously as I can. He said, we can all agree that Georgia, Bama, and Ohio State having what is 65 to 70% of the 5-stars is not good for the sport. The point is to get them to spread out to make other teams better options. And this is the thing I want to end on. I completely agree with that point. My problem is people think this isn't working and it's bad. Let's change it and it'll be better. Well, changing the playoff structure does not mean that you're going to have less talent at these teams. You might argue it was for a lot of other reasons, but just doing it in and of itself, any change doesn't necessarily make it better. I think it's just going to make it continue to be worse. And the same way NIL, a lot of people talk. I'm going to let you end it, Daniel, because it's obvious I'll talk forever, and I know you're exhausted. A lot of people argue NIL and the transfer portal were what was going to, completely bring parity back to college football. And what's been obvious is no. What NIL and the transfer portal do is they allow the teams that are the elite teams to leverage their financial resources to stay even further on top. And yeah, there have been a couple, Miami, Tennessee, Texas A&M, that went up, but all they did is they kind of reestablished themselves based off their historical dominance and alumni base, and they passed teams like Ole Miss and Mississippi State that have been hot risers, because Ole Miss cannot financially compete with Texas A&M and Tennessee. And so, yeah, it just transfer portal, the same thing. The elites, yeah, there's more parity between each other in that third tier world, but the elite teams, they're taking, like Alabama took a maybe first round running back, and they took wide receivers to fill all their holes. And USC, big time elite program historically, brought in a 5-star quarterback, top receiver in the country, blah, blah, blah. Like it is just helping the elites, even if it helps parity over here versus each other. It always helps the elites more. And every time you give them some way to get an advantage.
Yeah, I think what we're going to find out is coaching. Coaches leaving is the bigger issue, and one thing the playoffs will do is shine a light on maybe historically underachieving programs who have coaches that get their teams to the playoffs, and then those coaches are going to leave for brand names, because it's not just can you pay the head coach a salary? It's now, can you pay an entire staff? Like, can you pay your OC and DC $2 million a year? Do you have the alumni base big enough to compete with Tennessee's rumored to have paid $8 million for a quarterback? That's one player. Texas A&M is rumored to have paid $30 million for their class, which maybe that number's big and wrong, but it's still millions and millions of dollars, and Tulane ain't got it. Like, Tulane's NIL pool is going to be in the six figures. It just is. Like, it may be in the low millions, whereas Ohio State's is going to be in the tens of millions. And so these coaches are going to build their brand to get in the playoffs. There's a comment here about Deion Sanders that I'm going to have to save for a later video because I'm really disappointed in him. But they're going to build their brand to get that instant recognition, and then they're going to bolt. They're going to Luke Fickle it over to Wisconsin or somebody else like that. All right, y'all, I'm super tired. I told Josh, let's start this one early so we can go an hour and I can get to bed. And that was 43 minutes ago. So thanks for hanging on this late with us. It's been a lot of fun. This has been one of my favorites, Josh. We had a lot to talk about. Y'all have a great week.